You can build your site to be search engine friendly, or you can build your site to virtually guarantee it won't be indexed well and will never rank high up in the search results. I'm not just talking about the way you will be optimizing your site, but the basic technology you use that can limit how well you do in the search engines. So in this lesson, I'm going to explain a few things to watch for. Technology and format changes that can have a huge effect on how well you do in the search results. I'll be talking about things such as frames and iframes, images and flash, things that complicate your site from the search engine standpoint. You might think of the base unit of a search engine friendly site, one that indexes well, as being the HTML file, text that is tagged with HTML code in a file containing a title tag and a description. As you'll learn in this course, you can insert keywords into the file path, the location and file name, into the title, into the description, and elsewhere. Once you start moving beyond this point, things start to get problematic. So let's begin with images. It used to be common to find websites that were predominantly images. One new client of mine I discovered 15 years ago had a website that was created in Photoshop and saved as a series of images that were then linked together. So all the text in the site was not real text, it was text in an image. This allowed the web designer to create a very attractive website very quickly, but it was a disaster from an SEO standpoint. As HTML has become more sophisticated, and as web design skills have become more common, this kind of thing is much rarer these days. You do sometimes find nav bars created using text embedded into little images, rather than actual text in the HTML. That's okay, but just be aware that it won't be readable text. You need links throughout your site, and ideally some should be text links in order to tell the search engines what the link to page is about. You'll learn about that in later lessons. In any case, this form of navbar is far less common than it used to be thanks to the widespread use of CSS. Now, some of you may be thinking, but I bet Google reads the text in the images. Well, I think you need to assume that although Google has technology that allows it to read text in images, after all, Google Docs can read images and convert to text. It's not doing this for SEO purposes, and it's probably going to be years before text and images will be fully indexed, if ever. So you shouldn't expect images to help you with SEO. Now, I'm not saying you can't have images in your web pages. Of course you can. In fact, most websites need images. What I'm saying, though, is that you should remember that you need text for the search engines to index. I'll be talking more about that in a later lesson. And whenever you use images, whether you're using them for navigation bars or blocks of text, the content is not going to help you in the search engines. I'll explain later ways to optimize images so they may appear in image search results, but you'll actually be using text to optimize the images. The images themselves don't help SEO. Next, frames. Frames used to be very common and were a real problem in the search engines. I'm glad to say you don't see them so often these days, and when you do, they're not true HTML frames often. They're CSS layers. In fact, it's quite hard to find frames these days. I managed to find this example site that's been around for years, illustrating bad web design. As a matter of fact, these old frame tags are no longer supported in HTML. They were dumped in HTML5, though they do still work in popular browsers. So what I'm referring to here are HTML frame sets, which comprise 3 or more documents. The web page that loads is the frame definition or frame set document and contains instructions to the web browser telling it what frames you want and what to put into those frames. This code tells the browser to create 2 rows, the first of which is 91 pixels high, and the lower one takes up all the room that's left in the browser window below the first row. And within the second row, 2 columns are created, the first of which is 20% of the browser size. The code also tells the browser which documents to place into each frame: top.htm in the top bar, left.htm in the left column, and main.htm in the largest area. So I shouldn't spend too much time on frames because you probably won't be using them anyway, although some of you may have old sites that do still contain frames. But let me say a couple of things. The basic problem with frames is that search engines index individual pages, and frame sets comprise 3 or more HTML files, so the model just doesn't fit well with the way that search engines work. And as frames are disappearing from the web, the search engines probably don't think there's any need to come up with a workaround. So, because they don't fit the model well, pieces of the frame set can get indexed individually and documents can get orphaned, ending up in the search results out of their framed context. A search engine may link to the search content itself, which will then appear without the navigation. Even today, the search engines still state the frames are a problem. Google states that it does try to manage them properly, but also that it can't guarantee that it always will. Perhaps more common than frames are iframes. These are used to insert a window into a document, so another document can be viewed inside that first document through the window. In a sense, you're inserting one document into another in a very similar way that you would insert an image into the document. Note that I cut that previous Google quote for brevity, but in fact it actually says this. Thus, Google's comment that it has trouble managing frames also applies to iframes. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't use iframes, just that you should be aware that there could be problems with search engine indexing. There may be situations in which it makes perfect sense to use iframes, but you should know that the documents inserted into the iframes may get indexed separately, which may be perfectly fine in some situations. Now, Adobe Flash. Flash is a very popular animation format, and there are good reasons to use it. But it's another of those things that don't play well with the search engines. Search engines can index the content of Flash files, but not well. The proof? Ask yourself how often you see a Flash file listed in the search results near the top. Almost never, and only for keywords that are not very competitive. Also, there's a similar problem to frames. If you embed a Flash file in an HTML file, you now have 2 independent files, which may get indexed separately. However, as Flash doesn't rank well in search engines, you'll rarely find an orphaned Flash file in the search results. It used to be popular to create entire sites using Flash, which is generally a disaster from a search ranking standpoint. And now, at the time of filming this lesson, there's another problem. For a while, Firefox, one of the world's most popular browsers, actually disabled Flash by default so it couldn't run because of a security vulnerability. Adobe released an update, and that could now be run within Firefox, but many people are still using the old version that will be blocked. And Flash doesn't run on many mobile devices. There are ways to make Flash more SEO friendly by combining Flash with HTML. For instance, there's SWF Object, which allows a developer to embed Flash content into HTML using JavaScript. In effect, you provide alternatives, putting text into a div tag so that users can see the Flash, but the search engines will read the text. That's an advanced subject, though, which I won't be getting into. However, Google is actively discouraging people using mobile devices from visiting pages that contain Flash. Thus, there are a bunch of reasons to be wary of Flash. The security issue, of course, the fact that both Google and Firefox don't like it much and may discourage people from using it, and the fact that Flash simply never ranks well in the search engines. How about Silverlight, Microsoft's answer to Flash? Well, I'm sure most of you have never heard of it. It never quite caught on. You can assume that anything in Silverlight probably won't be indexed. Browsers don't support it well, and in fact Silverlight is disappearing as Microsoft is no longer developing it. Then there's PDF files. PDF files are read and indexed. However, ask yourself again, how often do you see PDF files at the top of the search results? It sometimes happens, but generally only when you use a really specific search phrase, and even with very specific searches, the search engines will still give preference to an HTML page if they can find a decent match. The only reason this patent, for instance, is appearing at the top of the search results is because I told Google I wanted to see a PDF file by including file type :PDF in the search query. Even though it's a very specific search, and the PDF is really the original document, without the file type piece, the PDF is not shown. I often find clients have a bunch of PDFs on their site because they already have various PDF documents and they can quickly drop them into the site. But it's often a good idea to convert the PDFs to HTML because HTML will probably rank better. PDFs don't use the HTML tags you'll be learning about later, tags we use to optimize pages for the search engines, title tags, description tags, H tags, and so on. So PDFs are at a disadvantage right from the start. This goes for other formats too. The search engines read and index various formats such as PowerPoint, Excel, PostScript, and so on. But don't count on these things doing much for your SEO efforts. They don't rank well. Now, something a bit geekier. What kind of URL is your system creating? You need a system that can create nicely keyworded URLs, not gobbledygook. As you'll learn later, we put keywords into URLs to help with SEO, and in fact Google even recommends that you do so. So a URL like this isn't helpful from an SEO perspective. This is a genuine URL, by the way. And here's the exact same product, but on a different site that has evidently done some SEO work. This would be much more useful from an SEO perspective. As I explained in the lesson on development tools, you need to be able to manipulate the URLs in some way to customize them and get keywords into them. Avoid using systems that can't do this, although most these days do provide a level of control. So this lesson has provided a few things to think about, things to avoid doing. I've had many clients over the years whose sites have been seriously hurt in the search ranks for these very things. Sites that were too image heavy, had too much flash, used PDFs instead of HTML and so on. You might want to spend a few minutes reviewing your site and content for these things, and if you have these problems, come up with a strategy for fixing them.